Walk the talk. So our goal is to help all of you find structures and strategies to translate that vision into what happens in classrooms every day. So a couple of additional ideas about why pedagogical leadership teams. So first of all, this work is grounded in what we know about adult learning theory and the theory of change. So we're very, very clear that working together is more powerful than working alone. And we also know that teachers don't change practice without coaching. And so pedagogical leadership teams are based on the notion that we want to tap into sufficient. You're really looking to change the way teachers as a community change what they do with students. And you don't want change in one classroom, but you want it over a number of classrooms in the school. Hopefully all the students, all the teachers who share the same students are practicing the same improved strategies. And lastly, one of the other things that is quite clear from research and also from practice is that there is oftentimes greater variation within a school than there is among schools. Meaning that if you walk from one classroom to the next in your school, you will see some examples of teaching that are outstanding, and you may see some examples of teaching that are not up to your standards. And that variation exists within almost all schools. And it is the job of the pedagogical leadership team to try to reduce the variation, but also raise the quality. So it's a dual purpose. Make sure that there aren't gaps so that it matters. You know, so often it matters which teacher your child gets as a parent, that you want to influence that, right? The reason you want to influence is because you know there's variations from classroom to classroom. And so the job of a leader or a leadership team is to address that notion of this variation in skill level among teachers within a school, but also to raise the level of everybody's performance. So a couple of ideas. One is the importance of creating these opportunities for teachers to work together. So learning is socially constructed. We say that that's true for adults. I happen to think it's true for all learners. I think students learn collaboratively as well, but we know that adults will learn best when they have the opportunity to talk about their work, to share it, to get ideas, to form this conversation with people who are doing what they're doing. That's how they construct knowledge, and they construct knowledge through this process of active inquiry into their teaching. It's not enough to tell somebody something, they have to actually do the work. Authentic tasks help contextualize the changes that you want. Oh, we want you to help your students be critical thinkers. What does that mean in my 6th grade math classroom? Unless you get down to that level and help contextualize the change that you want to see, if we leave it up to teachers to figure it out without this notion of collaboration, that's how you get a lot of variation. And finally, more expert and less expert participants learn from each other. And this doesn't mean that one teacher is the expert and another is the learner in all situations. It means that the job of the pedagogical leadership team is to make sure that people with expertise have the opportunity to talk with those who are less expert, but it varies. Sometimes you're an expert in math, but you may not be an expert in science. Sometimes you might be an expert in helping students be creative, but you might not be the expert in the communication. So really looking at your faculty and saying, you know, where are the areas of expertise, and help people learn from each other. One of the last ideas that I'm going to share before we move to our second section is that, and this is based on Michael Fullan's work, and some of you mentioned earlier that you're reading Michael Fullan. I think he's got a lot of great ideas. One that has really resonated with me as a leader is that there's this notion of developing human capital, which he poses as a process of developing an individual teacher. And that's what a lot of school leaders do, is they work with individual teachers to improve their practice, and they might move on to the next and to the next. What Michael Fullan is saying is that social capital, meaning when teachers work in collaboration with each other, with people who share a common interest, maybe the common grade level, the common content,
when they work with each other and there's collaboration, the learning is exponentially increased. So you are so much more likely to get change in the school when you position teachers to be able to work with others and create this social capital. I like to think of it as creating a fabric in the school that connects one classroom to the next, one teacher to the next. So pedagogical leadership teams actually help you create that fabric that pulls the school together. And it is, I think, based on a lot of Michael Fullen's research, that he says there is not enough time in a school to improve or to work on goals and improvement one teacher at a time. What really matters is creating those collaborators, because they will generate knowledge in amongst themselves. And then the leadership and the knowledge comes not just from a leader, but it comes from the collective. So, some key takeaways from this first session. Defining effective learning is the first step in translating the school's vision to learning experience that occur every day for every student. And unless you have clarity about the kind of learning that you want your students to be engaged in, unless you have clarity about that thing, it's really hard to have a pedagogical leadership team that's going to be effective. Start with what you as a school can agree that you want students to learn, and then move to creating these teams that create that social fabric in the school and can support adult learning in a collaborative sense, and that is focused on the school's definition of learning. So know what the learning is that you're seeking, and then create the structures so that that learning can become visible for every student every day. So with that, we had our break. We're a little bit behind, but I think we're in good shape. We're going to move to session 2.
So I was just making a couple of connections to what Diane was saying. The first thing, when she was reviewing that adult learning is socially constructed, one of the things that struck me is that we're engaging in this socially constructed experience today, very much so, through these sort of authentic tasks. The first authentic task that we did was talk about what is the definition of effective learning, and that is a prerequisite to really understanding how to create a culture of learning. And once we have that definition down and have connected sort of very specifically the 4 C's as part of that definition, now we can start to think and talk together and socially construct what it means to operationalize that definition. How do we bring that to life in a school, in an organization? And that's where we're going to start to focus in this next session. And so we're going to talk about what a pedagogical leadership team is and does. We've talked about the vision of the school, but now let's bring that down to the pedagogical leadership team. We're then going to talk about who could serve on the leadership team and how do we leverage the talent within our building, our organization, to really create an effective and powerful pedagogical leadership team. And then we'll start to look at what does their work really look like through some examples. And we'll socially construct our knowledge and our understanding of what does it look like for an effective team to operate, what are some things that we want to replicate in our own organization, and what are some things that I might do differently than what we're going to see in an example that we'll watch together and talk about. So that's the flow for the next session and how it connects to what Diane shared with us as the foundation for creating a culture of learning. So to start this, I want to spend just a few minutes, a bit of time, thinking about what really does a pedagogical leadership team do, and what should they not do? What are the guardrails? What is our task? What's our focus as a pedagogical leadership team? And I want to be incredibly transparent about this point. We chose to do this activity because we think it is really imperative that you do this in your own building if you're thinking about implementing a pedagogical leadership team. If we walk into this experience with different understandings of what this team is supposed to do, we'll have to spend some time resolving that dissonance and trying to figure out, why are we here at the table today on a Tuesday afternoon collaborating together? What really is our charge? And so by having this conversation up front and being transparent about what a team does and what a team does not do, what are some things that other stakeholders in the organization can take care of, that starts to mitigate some of that dissonance that happens. So we're going to spend some time thinking about that together. So I'd love for you at your tables, just with a partner, to think about, create on a scratch piece of paper this T-chart. On the left-hand side, what a PLT does, and on the right-hand side, what a PLT does not do. Spend about 1 or 2 minutes having that conversation, and then we'll talk as a group. Let's take a few moments to talk as a group about how we've thought about the definition of what a PLT does and what they do not. And the real heart of this conversation, how do those actions support a culture of learning? That definition of effective, engaged, socially constructed learning that we just talked about. So let's start with the left-hand side, what a PLT does. Who would like to share a conversation that they had at their table about the important role or what a PLT does? Let's start right here. Thanks. My colleague Jason is going to chart for us as well,
okay.
some of the key ideas.
Okay, thank you. What we were discussing on here about the orientation that the leaders should apply at the beginning of each school year, especially for new teachers, for the first year teachers, let's say. It is really, really important. It's something that if the schools or the teams, the PLT teams, don't do, they have to apply it, and it should be like something, reach the point and hit the point. What are the objectives of the school? What is the vision of the school? What are the values of the school? Should be so clear for the first year teachers. So otherwise they will be lost. What is the environment that they will be in? They will be introduced to the community that they will be a part of. So they will not be shocked or do things we don't want them to do.
Great, thank you. So this idea that a critical role of the PLT is to, one, have clarity about the mission and vision of their school and what that mission and vision is, but even more importantly, ensuring that everyone in the school has the same clarity, the same level of clarity about what we do, with the particular emphasis on new teachers as we're bringing new teachers, perhaps not just first-year teachers, even veteran teachers that come from a different school into our context to just define new teachers, so that we all can start to pull in the same direction with this concept of distributed leadership. So the PLT is not the only body who is working on the mission and vision of the school. We're collectively doing that together. The PLT's role is to make sure that there's clarity around that mission and vision, and that is socialized, the mission and vision. Thank you very much. Yes.
I will summarize what we've discussed here actually in this group. We said that they lead by example, and they assess and appraise that everything is on the same page, all on the same page, as Nermeen mentioned. They are good listeners, and they provide tools and resources. They make sure that all the resources are there. And
I want to tease this idea out just a little bit, because the pedagogical leadership team's role, we're only two bullet points in, and it's starting to get really big. And so as we think, we're replicating the conversation that we may have in our own organizations about what should our role be. If we were all a pedagogical leadership team, I think we could all agree that it's about ensuring that there's clarity around the mission and vision, and that we're socializing that and sharing that. That we are, what I heard you all talk about is that we're assessing that things are moving forward effectively, that we're providing the level of resources or the right resources that everyone needs. The question that comes to my mind is, how do we do that? What are some of the specific things that allow us to assess whether or not things, the kind of quote unquote, are moving forward effectively? our mission and vision is moving forward effectively. Because that can be really broad. And so as a PLT, if we were a PLT, I would push us to say, let's get really specific on what we mean by assessing effectiveness of our school. And the resource piece as well. How do we ensure that everyone has the appropriate resources? Remember when we started this conversation, we talked a lot about keeping this group focused, the PLT, on those closest to the students in the classroom. So resources could be really big, right? It could be everything from sort of wraparound social services that our students need to get from their home to school effectively. It could be breakfast that we provide to our students or lunch that we feed to our students. Does a PLT need to focus on, or should they focus, I should say, on those kinds of things, on providing a lunch program for our students? Is that the PLT's role? This is the pedagogical leadership team. The word pedagogue, and this is my bias, so I'm just going to say this is my bias, but in the name of not trying to balloon our role so big that we can't do it effectively, we want to stay really focused on those actions, those teaching and learning actions that are closest to the students in our classroom. So it's not to diminish the importance of a lunch program, for example, but in our pedagogical leadership team, what we may say to ourselves is, who else can do that so we can maintain a focus on pedagogy or instruction? And that's a valuable and really healthy conversation. Thank you, I appreciate it.
Picking up on the first point, I would think that the pedagogical leadership team's role would be to translate this vision into actual practice within the classrooms by ensuring, for example, that the standards and the practices of the program are implemented.
So we have a mission and vision. Now we know that it's clear and everyone understands it. What does that really look like in the classroom? What are the teaching practices that are going to help us realize the promise of this mission and vision? Let's define those things. Those things will also help us get clearer and more specific on what we're assessing as a pedagogical leadership team. Terrific, thank you. Other ideas on what a pedagogical leadership team does?
Motivation?
Motivation. I love this. So a pedagogical leadership team certainly has to be very clear about their tactics and make sure that everyone has a clear focus and is on the same page. We have to be inspirational too, and someone said we have to model the practices that we expect everyone to engage in, and some of that is being inspirational for our colleagues, being motivational for our students. So the way in which we motivate is to fulfill the promise of what we've set out to do in the mission and vision, and that everyone in the building can see that we are getting traction on that mission and vision. We're achieving our goals. When we start to set goals as a pedagogical leadership team and then don't realize those because of all the barriers that come in place, we lose motivation very quickly. So to drill down into this idea of motivation a little bit, it's about the PLT helping move forward and realize some wins, fulfill objectives or goals that we have defined that help us get closer to our mission and vision. And some lift-ups. Yeah, I like that word, lift-ups. We're going to talk more about motivation later today as well, and what role that plays, and we're actually going to define motivation with 3 terms. So just a little preview. So feedback.
Okay, feedback, reflection as an evaluation for our learning, teaching strategies.
How does the pedagogical leadership team provide that feedback or that reflection?
When they visit us in the classrooms and see if there's a better way to.
So up here we said, just so that everyone can hear, one way in which we can provide feedback and observation is to get into teachers' classrooms and to do these observations and to provide very specific feedback to teachers in relation to what our goals are, mission and vision, how we've defined effective instruction, the 4 C's, for example. If that is your charge, noble charge, we have to create the time and space to do that as a PLT. So we're starting to, again, understand that there are many things that are important, but those things may start to compete with one another because we have limited time as a PLT.
Just want to add something here. Just a moment ago, I spoke to the fact that we can approach one teacher at a time, or we can really use the collective to diminish the variation. So when I just heard that piece about motivation and visiting individual classrooms, I'm thinking, well, what are the other structures that exist in a school so that I can reach many teachers at the same time and create that motivation within a group of teachers as opposed to always relying on, not always, but simply relying on one-to-one. That's important, and you never want to lose that. But there's also looking for opportunities to share and to create motivation in groups of teachers as well.
Let's move on to what a PLT does not do, because I think this will help us contrast. Yes, yes, please.
More flexibility in the PLT with the others.
So this idea of being flexible, we're going to tease that out a little bit in the next piece, in the next activity. And we'll do that in a couple of ways by thinking about who serves on the PLT in relation to what we're trying to achieve, and can there be some flexibility even in the composition of the PLT members. What does a PLT not do?
Right
here?
Hi.
Hi.
I think they don't do operations, and I think they do strategy.
So very simply, they don't do operations. They do strategy related to instruction. If I could add to that a little bit, is that an acceptable? Okay. So no operations. Why not operations?
Because from my understanding about operations, that's detail that can be given to different teams in the school, whereas strategy is about our movement forward as a team.
Yeah.
And what we do to do it.
One of the biggest complaints that I've heard about instructional leadership or pedagogical leadership is that there's not enough time in my day to do everything that's in my job description. And so we have to search for ways in which to distribute some of those things and be really clear about what my role as a pedagogical leader is and what our role as a pedagogical leadership team is and what it is not. And operations, again, while very important, that's something else that someone on the management team may be able to do, or an operational leader may be able to do. That looks very different in different schools and organizations. But structurally thinking about that and bifurcating those responsibilities, I think becomes really important given what our role is to focus on instruction to impact this idea of a culture of learning.
Maybe not to work in isolation and make sure that there is collaboration with the teachers and always have a sense of what's going on in the classroom so that it doesn't seem, the decisions don't seem like they're top-down decisions. So having a sense of what's going on in the school.
So not working in isolation. And I want to use this as an opportunity to transition into the next part of the conversation because this key idea that teachers are clear about what the PLT is doing. It's not a black box. It's very transparent what the PLT is doing, and some of that transparency may come in the form of who's sitting on the PLT. So let's talk about that just a little bit. I'd love for you to spend just a moment thinking about this question of who serves on the PLT. And the second question, what are the characteristics of these individuals? So if you would take just a moment at your table again to address those first two questions, who serves on the PLT and what are the characteristics of these individuals, and then we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, welcome back. Let's talk just for a few minutes about who serves on the PLT and what are the characteristics of these individuals. What I really wanted to surface through this is the concept that you probably have some talent in your own organizations or buildings that you can already leverage. If you don't have a PLT established yet and you're thinking about establishing a new PLT, certainly we want to think about not only what a PLT does, but who then can contribute to that mission and vision and to the roles of what the PLT is, or what that definition is that we just established. Who's the talent in my building, and how do we guard against isolation, working in isolation based on this composition or the development of a PLT and who serves on it. So let's talk for a little bit about who serves on the PLT. Who wants to start? Yes.
In order to be the head of your school or your organization, in my point of view, you must to start as a teacher first, and then to be the head of your school, because you want to understand the environment, you want to understand the teacher and the student, if you are not a teacher. So if you are only the manager of the school or the organization, you are going to deal with things as an object. And you can understand the feeling of the teacher, and you can understand the student. So we have this in Jerusalem, because the head of the school must teach. Yes, we have this in Jerusalem, that the manager or the head of the school must teach at least one class or two classes each week. So this will help to understand the environment.
Yeah, terrific. So if the school leader is responsible for ensuring that instruction is really high level and high quality, then they have to really deeply understand instruction, and that could happen through experience that they have had within the school, perhaps outside of another school, but they've had some teaching experience and deeply understand instruction. So then given that, does the school leader or manager serve on the PLT? Yes, I heard a yes. Why is it important that the school manager or the leader serves on the PLT?
They serve because with everyone else, they still have that power of to say yes or no, or to implement, or to convince, or not to convince.
So they have the power to set the agenda. And as the school leader, I am responsible for ensuring that this school ultimately serves the needs of my students. And if that is my responsibility, then I must ensure that we are working towards that mission and vision with clarity, with focus, with discipline, and with accountability. And so it's critical then that I, as the school leader or the manager, serve on the PLT. Sometimes we see that idea diffused a little bit almost, because we want distributed leadership in our building. We want others to share in the responsibility of ensuring success. But the clear point here is that we can have both. We can have distributed leadership, but at the same time have clarity around what our agenda is, and one person has to ultimately be responsible for ensuring that we're moving that agenda forward. And that may come in the form of the board, if you have a school board, saying to that person, tell me how you know you're successful in your school. It may come in the form of the community saying to that school leader, tell me how you know that you're serving the needs of my students, of my children. And so that person becomes very critical in moving the agenda forward. But they don't do it alone. They do it with the help in a distributed leadership model of others. Who are those others? Who are the other people that serve on this PLT?
Well, while we were discussing it here at our table, we found out that because each one of us comes from a different school with a different background. So we found out that the definition of a pedagogical leadership team is totally different from one school to another. So we have 4 different structures on this table. But we did find out that one thing in common was that all of them had academic leaders on the pedagogical leadership team, in addition to others. Now, the others that you're asking about, in some schools, they come in the form of people responsible for well-being, people responsible for IT, people responsible for, in addition to the academics.
Mm-hmm. But the missing part was the student. There is no student in the PLT. So I think it's the time to, pick like maybe one of the senior student to be part of this PLT.
Yeah, two really critical ideas here. If we're trying to ensure cohesion and alignment in our school, then we can't forget that a PLT can't work in isolation. A PLT's primary focus is on instruction, but there are other very closely related concepts like the budget and a budget officer or a person in charge, chief of budget, who's in charge of making sure we get the right resources. So if they're connected to the conversation of the PLT in a very tight way, they may serve on the PLT, or there may just be a communication link in some way, shape, or form, but that helps them understand the rationale for when you're asking for certain resources. Technology is the same way. If we have to deploy technology to help us be more efficient in our work and achieve the mission and vision that's very tightly aligned to instruction, what technology can best do that? And so perhaps there's an opportunity to shorten those conversations by bringing those members onto the PLT. The one guard against that is that then the PLT's conversation doesn't focus solely on technology. For example, we maintain a close focus and a targeted focus on instruction, with technology serving as that resource. The second key idea that came out of here is the student voice. How powerful is that student voice serving on the PLT? They're ultimately the folks that we are trying to impact through this work. And so why not ask them? Why not involve them in these decisions? I think that's a fantastic idea. Let's talk a little bit about, are there anyone else, let's talk about the characteristics. What are the characteristics of PLT members? What makes a good PLT member? Yes.
Hi. They have to be open-minded and good listeners, open for communication. They're accepting new ideas, not to be stubborn and not, accepting. And to be flexible, yes.
Great. Flexible, open-minded, growth mindset.
Yes.
Fantastic. What are some other characteristics?
I think a person who believes in school's mission and vision, and he is well known about the details and where we are going with the school, and he is worried about every single details in the daily process.
Other characteristics?
Maybe they are coming from different backgrounds, but they're maybe subjects or like this.
So we might have teachers who come from different subjects that serve on the PLT to help us understand their perspective and what it might look like to achieve these key instructional moves in science, in mathematics, in English. So oftentimes we see department heads of that department, of the science department, or grade level leads. I'm the lead teacher for 5th grade. So those folks serve on the PLT and help distribute kind of the mission and vision and socialize that with their colleagues. And hearing their voice, how does this mission and vision look in science, in English language arts? What are some of those expectations are really critical. So one characteristic is that we have representation from all stakeholders or from multiple stakeholders. Any other important characteristics? Yes?
To be objective.
Why is
that in order to know what to do, to focus on tasks and to focus in order to translate
You don't need it. That was perfect. This idea of objectivity really becomes important because the PLT is going to be asked to do, they're going to be pulled in a lot of different directions. There are multiple needs often in organizations or schools. Sometimes those needs are competing. And so trying to understand through an objective lens which need is more important now, given what's going to serve our students best, is really important to frame decisions that are made about where we're spending our time as a PLT and where we're going to spend our time as a school community. So this idea of objectivity and rational decision making through a lens of growth mindset becomes critical for that.
Yep. what you said made me think of other teams that I've known where people want to join the team because they have an agenda. They have something they want to get done, as opposed to subscribing to what the group agrees to achieve. And those, when you say objective, that's something that really came to my mind, and that we want to make sure that the people who join the team are not there for their own self-interest, that they're there for the interest of the group.
Just transparently done these two activities that perhaps would help as you start to form your own PLT or evolve it and refine it. One, define what a PLT does and what they don't do so that you have clarity around that. And two, start to think about what are the characteristics that make up a good PLT member, who could serve on that team to effectively meet our mission and vision. So doing this same activity in your own organization may have some power depending on where you are in the evolution of your PLT. Let's talk a little bit then about what does an effective PLT look and sound like. We talked about what it does, what it doesn't do, who serves on the PLT. Well, how do they work? What does it really look like to work in a PLT and to be effective in our work? One of the things that we talk a little bit about, and we're going to pass this out as we talk, thank you, is really understanding the perspective that each of us have. Not just the role that we serve, which we just talked about, but our own biases, our own perspectives, how we think about and view the world. And one way to start to do that is through this idea of a leadership orientation. We're all leaders of some sort when we're serving on this team. How do I view the world as a leader, though? And how does me understanding how you view the world help us interact more effectively? So we're going to talk a little bit about that through this concept of leadership orientations. And what Jason Culbertson is passing out right now is a survey. It's a very quick survey. This comes from the work of Bowman and Deal. For those of you that are familiar with Bowman and Deal and their work in terms of organizational structures and what effective organizations look and feel like. So when you get this survey, the first page is a very brief sort of self-assessment for yourself. And if you'll complete that self-assessment, for each number, there are 4 choices. You're going to put a number 1, 2, 3, or 4 on each of those choices. So number 1, it gives you this statement, my strongest skills are, and then there's choices A, B, C, and D. You're going to label 1 through 4, with 1 being your weakest and 4 being your strongest, what you think your strongest skills are. And you're going to follow that same process all the way down through 6. Once you've finished with that, you're going to add up all of the A's. So 1A, 2A, 3A, add those numbers together, and the total you put next to the bottom, next to the ST. Add 1B, 2B, 3B together, put that total next to HR, and so on. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do this, and then we'll continue with unpacking these leadership orientations. One other small nuance to the directions. You have to use a 1, a 2, a 3, and a 4. You can't put 2 4s in the same number. If you've had a chance to plot your scores on the next page, if you would help a neighbor do that as well. So on the next page, you'll see a graph. And if you will plot your total, when you have the total next to ST, that stands for structural. So you'll take the total number next to ST, you'll find where that number fits on the grid on the next page, and you'll put a dot there. You'll do the same for the others, HR for human resource, SY for symbolic, and PL for political. If you'll help a neighbor do that real briefly, and then we'll talk. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think everyone's had an opportunity to do the self-assessment, to plot their scores. The next step is to have a conversation about what this means, and page 3 gives us a little bit of information about the structural orientation, the symbolic, the human resource, and the political. It gives you a little bit of a description of what each of those orientations are. The way that we're going to process this is in small groups, and so you're going to find the leadership orientation that was the highest score for you. So the most dominant one. If you had the highest score for structural, you're going to come to this piece of chart paper and you're going to have a conversation with the other colleagues that were structural, that had that as their highest orientation. And the conversation is going to revolve around the 3 bullet points on the bottom of this slide. What are some key attributes of that orientation? And those attributes can come from the descriptions that are on page 3, but they can also come from your own interpretation, your own experience, your own background. If you're a highly structural person, you might talk about what are some of the attributes of why you're a structural person. The next thing you're going to talk about are some potential pitfalls. What are some potential pitfalls of operating exclusively in this orientation? And so whoever's charting for your group, if you would create a chart that looks like this. This is the attributes, potential pitfalls of operating exclusively in this orientation, and then the third part of the conversation on the bottom, what might you need to accommodate for what's missing? If you're a highly structural person, but you're not symbolic at all, what might you need to do in order to accommodate for some of those missing attributes that symbolic folks have? I'd love for you to have that conversation. So structural, you're here. Human resource in the back on my left. Symbolic in the back on my right. And political on my right on this wall. If you'll move to the one orientation that represents your strongest or your highest score, and then have a conversation with your colleagues about these 3. And please chart your conversation in bullet points here so that we can look around and talk as a group in just a moment. Okay, if you'll wrap up your conversations and come on back to your seats. There were a couple of choices that I could make as a facilitator right now, just to be transparent about those. One is to, while folks are standing at their posters, lead this debrief and really unpack each of these questions. What are the key attributes of structural, for example? What are some of the pitfalls of operating exclusively in that orientation? And what might we need to do to accommodate for what's missing? So that's one way to facilitate this conversation. Another way could be what we're going to do, which is to summarize just briefly some of the things that were listed under each orientation, and then to talk more about why and what might we need to do to accommodate for what's missing and why this is important in the frame or in the context of a pedagogical leadership team. So very briefly, we see that structural are very analytical, structured thinkers. We have listed here perfectionists, high standards and expectations. They love plans. Absolutely love to produce plans, and deadlines. Not afraid of deadlines at all. Those drive structural thinkers. Operating exclusively, some potential pitfalls of operating exclusively in this orientation is that, sure, goal orientation is really important and it's helpful to get things done, but we sometimes may do that without thinking about how other people feel. And your HR folks kind of are driven crazy by that, right? Because they love to think about how everyone feels and to make sure that we're all included and that there's fairness, and that conflict doesn't happen. Oftentimes, that's a key attribute of an HR person. They're very good at resolving conflict. Structural folks, if that conflict gets in the way of my deadline, so be it. We're going to meet the deadline. So what do we need to do to accommodate for what's missing? Some of the things listed here, support from other team members. Just engage, for example, the HR frame and say, hey, I know this about myself. Can you help me, please? So that I am sure to pay attention to how everyone is being included, how they're feeling about the decisions, that they have buy-in, etc. So that's what these 3 are really getting at, to create this diverse team and to identify your own personal areas for growth and be reflective on those and conscious of those as you're moving through your goal orientation to hit your deadlines. We had a lot of structural folks in the room. We had a lot of structural folks. We could have split that into 2 or 3 groups. So you all are very goal-oriented. You like deadlines. You're going to get things done. We had a lot of HR people in the room too. And HR folks said that we're collaborators, we're team workers, we support one another. We're coaches by nature. And we're really good listeners. One of our pitfalls, though, may be that we're too patient. And if there are 40 people in this room, we want to be sure that every single person's voice is heard. And when we ensure that every single person's voice is heard, that starts to make the structural people get a little nervous because they're watching their clocks. And they're wondering how much time are we going to spend on really making sure everyone is heard. They may give too many chances, you listed here, and overwhelm yourselves because conflict is sometimes difficult with the HR frame. It may not be something natural that you gravitate towards. And so that can lead to some feelings of being overwhelmed. Even if there are a lot of deadlines that I have to meet, how am I going to meet all those deadlines when I need to ensure that we have everyone's voice involved in the decision? So how do we accommodate that? We train ourselves to stick to deadlines. And we find other people that can help us with that. We also create a diverse team by pulling on some structural folks. So imagine if this group of people were your PLT. Just that group of people, you are all HR folks. It could happen. In education, we see this a lot. There may be a tendency to want to ensure that we're doing so much that everyone has buy-in as the PLT that we lose focus on the mission and vision. And that's where the symbolic people can help us. The symbolic orientation, they're visionary. They're absolutely visionary. And they communicate that vision through stories. They communicate that vision through pictures. They do that and they inspire folks. They're incredibly motivating. We talked about motivation earlier, being a key aspect or a characteristic of serving on a PLT. Your symbolic individuals can really help inspire and keep that motivation high. Conflict with the structured mentality may be a pitfall. What are some potential pitfalls of operating exclusively in this orientation? Conflict with the structured mentality. So I have this huge vision. My job is to communicate that and to bring everyone along. I may not be so good at creating the detailed implementation plan that accompanies that vision. I may need someone to help me who's the structure person on our PLT to create that implementation plan. I have some really ambitious goals oftentimes as a symbolic leader, and I'm not going to let anything get in the way of those goals, even the lack of a plan. But we all know that planning is important, and meeting deadlines are important because structured people are not going to have it. So having someone structured to help you with that is incredibly important. We see a lot of the other then ways in which we can accommodate for some of these strengths and operating exclusively in this orientation, which is to create a diverse team and to make your vision, to think about how your vision can become real and operationalized. So force yourself to do that thinking. And then we had the political frame. We had one person. We had one person. Yes, thank you. What is your name? Nariman. Nariman was our political person. Thank you for being political. Jason Culbertson was feeling left out because he is off the chart political. He's off the chart. And Diane is off the chart political. So, like the structural folks, they're incredibly mission-driven and mission-focused. But one thing that's unique about the political folks is that they will engage in conflict because they see it as healthy if it helps us achieve our mission and vision. Conflict is not a bad thing. Conflict, if it gets in the way of achieving the mission and vision, is somehow solved. And that might be engaging directly in that conversation or figuring out how to go around that conflict. They are really good with scarce resources. So if you have limited budgets at your school or in your organization, they are highly strategic at figuring out how to use those scarce resources in order to achieve the mission and vision. What they forget is the HR component. So we had a lot of HR people over there who might feel like their feelings are hurt, we're not heard, there's no empathy from some of the ways in which the political people operate. But what's interesting about that is the political orientation doesn't see it that way. They actually don't feel like they're hurting your feelings. They're just trying to get the mission accomplished. Exactly. So the thing we can do to accommodate for that is to be really mindful of particularly the HR frame and how those folks are feeling as we operate. What's the big why behind this? What's the big why as it relates to our PLTs? Why did we spend time doing this today?
Hello, to include in that team a little bit of everything. So when we need to write a vision, then we get, let's say as an example, the structural part and make sure they have a plan with deadlines. When we need to include other in that group, then we ask other people to help us. So we become a team. So whenever the job is needed, that group with the qualities will take care of that.
So obviously creating a diverse team is really important. What if we don't have that diversity? There's a lot of people in this room. We are all a PLT now, and there's one person who's political. So we don't have a lot to draw on. So what can we do if there is a lack of sort of an orientation that's represented in some way, shape, or form on our PLT?
So we know where we stand and how we should self-develop if we're lacking people or resources or human power.
Yeah. We were having an interesting conversation. Tell me your name again. Taba? Yeah, Taba and I were having an interesting conversation, and she said, I know myself really well. I'm highly structural. That's my highest orientation. But I often operate in the symbolic frame because context makes me do that. So even though this I know about myself, this is my natural sort of orientation, if I'm put in the context of a leader who has to drive an organization forward and tell stories in the community to gather and harness resources, I start to develop those skills if I'm aware of that. If I'm aware that that is really important. And so even though you may not have this natural orientation of being structural, political, symbolic, or HR, if we're aware of that, we can start to operate within that frame more if that's important to what you do and your work. So the big point there is, if you don't have anyone political on your PLT, you can still operate and talk about as an organization or as a team, what do we need to do through the political lens in order to harness scarce resources? Other big takeaways? Any other big takeaways in terms of why this is important? Why might you do this with your PLT? We're now a new PLT. Why would you do this with them? How would this conversation help you?
Is it to be aware of your weakness?
Say it again?
Be aware of your weaknesses.
Yeah, obviously to be aware of your weaknesses so that you can mitigate those as much as possible. Why else might you do this?
I think it's about knowing your school and knowing your team and then thinking about where you need to plug the gaps. So if you don't have somebody who's in the political orientation, it's finding the one who is most adaptable to the political orientation. And you can only do that once you know yourselves and know your team as well. So reflection.
Okay. We're running a little bit behind, but it is 1 o'clock. And so we'll commit to ending and starting on time. So 1 o'clock for lunch. We'll be back in here at 2 o'clock. We'll pick up this conversation and sort of wrap up some of the considerations for forming our team and how we work, and then we'll get into some of the structures and functions that can help us work very effectively. enjoy your lunch. Thank you.